Ruby Bridges writes in her award-winning book, Through My Eyes, the 1950s and 60s were important decades. Negroes, as African Americans were known then, dared at last to demand equal treatment as American citizens. When Ruby Bridges started kindergarten, she and several other African American students were chosen to take a very difficult test. This test determined whether or not they were able to attend an all-white school. Ruby was one out of only 6 students who passed the test. She would be attending William Frantz Public School in New Orleans, Louisiana the following year. Students throughout the entire school had been unenrolled by their parents. Upon Ruby's arrival on November 19, 1960, she had to be escorted to school every day by U.S. Marshals to avoid the angry mobs of people shouting racial slurs and even threatening to physically harm her. The brave 6-year-old would change the way we live today and pave the way for other strides towards racial equality.
Before Ruby was born, black coats and Jim Crow laws following the Civil War would be a major factor in the start of segregation in the southern United States. These were laws passed in 1865, which would dictate what black people could and couldn't do during this time. Ruby Bridges was born on September 8, 1954, and lived in Tylertown, Mississippi. That same year, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the end of separate but equal education for black students. This principle of separate but equal was established in 1896 as a result of the Plessy v. Ferguson case. During this time, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as racially separated facilities were equal, that they were not in violation of the Constitution and were not discrimination. Even despite this case, black and white separated facilities were very different. During segregation, the black schools in the South were given less funds than all the white schools. Their textbooks were outdated, along with all of their supplies. Their roofs leaked, and they had ongoing issues which weren't being fixed. Overall, black schools were treated worse than the white schools during this time, and this is why the Separate but Equal Act would fall apart. During segregation, African Americans and other races besides whites were treated unfairly. Everything was separated: schools, stores, benches, and even water fountains. You were arrested if you failed to comply to these biased rules. For example, in 1955, Rosa Parks was riding on a bus, and during this time, blacks had to sit in the back of the bus while whites got to sit in the front. Rosa sat down in the bus until a white man then told her to move. She refused and got arrested because she said no. During a huge stride towards the end of segregation in the South of the United States, a group of 9 African American high school students integrated into Little Rock Central High School in 1957. They were known as the Little Rock Nine, and they would help pave the way for opportunity for young black students in America like Ruby. They faced similar problems just as Ruby would in the future. They had to have Army and National Guard escorts to school to avoid angry mobs outside. Even through the hardships they faced, they continued on through school. Some of the Little Rock Nine students, including Ernest Green and Carlotta Walls, would continue on to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. Ruby's grandparents on both sides were sharecroppers. Ruby's mother said, quote, "Sharecropping is hard work. On the day before Ruby was born, I carried 90 pounds of cotton on my back. I wanted a better life for Ruby." End quote. When Ruby was 4, her family moved to the old seaport city of New Orleans. Ruby explains how everyone on her block was black, and the white families lived on the next block. During that time, federal court in New Orleans was about to force 2 public all-white schools to let black students attend. In the late spring of that year, her school began testing African American students to find out which children would be sent to the all-white schools. Ruby states, quote, "I was only 5, and I'm sure I didn't have any idea why I was taking it. Still, I remember that day. I remember getting dressed up and riding uptown on the bus with my mother, and sitting in an enormous room in the school board building along with 100 other black kids, all waiting to be tested." End quote. That summer, the NAACP informed the Bridges family that Ruby was one of just a few African American students to pass the test. Her parents argued about what to do. Her father wanted nothing to do with school integration, but Ruby's mother thought it was a great opportunity for her and was worth the risk. She wanted Ruby to get the best education possible. Finally, she convinced Ruby's father.
On November 14, 1960, Ruby was set to go into her first day at William Frantz Elementary. That day, U.S. Marshals were at her home knocking on the door. They were there to escort her to school. In Ruby's book, she states what the Marshals told her mother before getting out of the car that morning. "Let us get out of the car first. Then you'll get out and the 4 of us will surround you and your daughter. We'll walk up to the door together. Just walk straight ahead and don't look back." They told her that to make sure Ruby wouldn't see the racist remarks written on their signs or their angry faces. People were shouting, even saying they were going to hurt Ruby. The only way U.S. Marshals could keep the people back was by threatening to arrest them. brave 6-year-old would have to deal with these people shouting and protesting her education and not say a word. Ruby spent the first days of school in her principal's office to avoid chaos as angry parents withdrew their students from school. Only one teacher was willing to accept her as a student, named Barbara Henry. Ruby was in a class of 1, ate lunch alone, and played with her teacher at recess. Virtually every student was taken out of school, even students that weren't in Ruby's class. Even despite everything happening to her at this time, Miss Henry said that Ruby was always eager to come to school and learn. School segregation and integration was a conflict of interest during the Civil Rights Movement. Numerous court cases such as Brown versus Board of Education encouraged the upholding of rights given to people in the Constitution. Activists were looking towards desegregating public and private schools in the South, as well as implementation of African American students into schools with white peers.
After time, more and more students began to attend school with Ruby. Only one student, named Yolanda Gabriella, came to school with Ruby when she was first integrated. Parents became less worried about her being in school, but about the protesters outside causing possible harm to their own children. Protesters outside the school would yell racial slurs and throw tomatoes at Ruby as she entered. In the first few days of integration, riots broke out throughout the city. Ruby Bridges states in Through My Eyes, quote, "As I sat quietly beside Miss Henry, mobs of protesters roamed the streets," end quote. Protesters would throw bricks and rocks at passing cars and leave burning crosses in black neighborhoods. White people traveled to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to protest integration in front of the state legislature. They wanted the federal judge who ordered school integration, J. Kelly Wright, to be kicked out of office.
As time went on, towards the end of her first year of elementary school, things were back to normal for Ruby. There were no more angry protesters outside, and Ruby no longer had to be escorted by U.S. Marshals to school. Ruby would leave a lasting impact on society. Today, schools are fully integrated, restaurants serve all races, and drinking fountains, as well as bathrooms, are available to all races. Ruby is a major factor in this because she played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. She inspired people of color to call for equal rights, and the reason why segregation in schools is no more, and the reason why all people have the same rights no matter their race, was largely an effect of the actions of a brave 6-year-old in 1960.